I'm going to give you a very, very quick update on the DNA project, and then I'm going to talk very specifically about the Finding Grace project, which is something that has been running now since January this year. But for those of you who are not familiar with the O'Malley DNA project, it's run on the website Family Tree DNA, which you can see here, number 1. We also have the associated blog, which gives an in-depth analysis of some of the data generated by the project. And of course, for all of your genealogy questions, we have the Facebook group. And that is a great place for making new friends and getting in touch with O'Malley cousins and relatives. There's also some previous updates and videos on YouTube, and you'll see the links there, and I'm going to put it into a little handout later on, which then can be emailed to all of the attendees. But we have updates from 2017, from 2019, from 2021, and we have a special video that looks at the Black Book of Limerick, a medieval manuscript, and what it tells us about the O'Malleys of Limerick. So there's a lot of information available on the project online. Now, recruitment to the project has been steadily increasing, and it really took off in 2017, and over the last year we've grown to 270 people in total. You can see we had 63 new recruits last year, 40 the year before, 39 the year before that. So we really had a very, very good year in the last 12 months in 2022. And among the 270 people who have joined the project, 136 of them have done the Y-DNA test. Now, Y-DNA is only passed from father to son, so it's very useful for tracking back along the father line in the same way that the surname is passed from father to son, and therefore the DNA can help us track the surname back in time. There are 3 types of Y-DNA test on offer from Family Tree DNA. We have the Y37 test, which is the very, very basic one. We have the Y111 test, which tests 111 markers. And then we have the big Y700 test, which is the ultimate test. And the first 2 test STR markers, and the big Y test tests STR markers and SNP markers. And you can see there that it tests about 200,000 of them, which is really quite a lot. And we've had more and more people doing the Big Y test, and currently 50 of the 270 people in the project have actually done this ultimate Y-DNA test. Now, on the results page, here we have over on the left-hand column all of the kit numbers of the people involved in the Y-DNA project, their surname, their most distant ancestor, and over on the right-hand side, there is just a list of numbers which represents their Y-DNA signature. And just to the left of that, we have the haplogroup column, and that's where is listed the SNP data for each individual person. And like I say, it's the big Y test that we need to use to generate the SNP data. So where do the O'Malleys come from? Well, if you look at surname distribution maps, we're going to see a big bunch of them around Mayo and another little cluster around Limerick. And from that, you'd think that those 2 hotspots might be associated with perhaps 2 different genetic signatures. That's what we would expect to see, maybe 2 different signatures from the name arising independently in those places. But in actual fact, what we find is that there are 17 distinct genetic signatures for the O'Malleys. And on this diagram here, it shows how they're all related. The 17 groups are here at the very bottom of the diagram, and then we have a timeline on the right and on the left detailing the various epochs in Ireland that our ancestors lived through, from the last ice age through the first settlers, the first farmers, the Celts, all the way up to the Great Famine 200 years ago, and then the present day. And the interesting thing is that the common ancestor for all the O'Malleys lived about 47,000 years ago. So we do have a common ancestor, and we don't know what his name was, and we don't know where he lived, but we know he lived about 47,000 years ago. If you look at just the group 3 O'Malleys, and they're the dark green ones down here, The one that is the largest is group 3A, and that is this group down here. And these are thought to represent the descendants of the original person who started the O'Malley surname in Mayo. And his name was Malley. And all of his descendants were O'Malley, the son of Malley or the descendant of Malley. And all of the group 3 groups are associated with this SNP signature up here, M222, which is also associated with Nile of the 9 hostages. Whereas if we look at the light green groups over here, which are all the Limerick groups, they're associated with the SNP signature L226, which is associated with Brian Boru. So two very, very different origins for the Mayo and the Limerick O'Malleys. But we're going to focus on the Mayo O'Malleys, specifically group 3A, in the rest of this presentation. And this is the route that the Mayo O'Malleys took out of Africa 250,000 years ago. And on the right-hand side, you can see 3 people who successfully completed that migration in record time. It only took them 249,000 years to do it. And if you ask them nicely, they'll show you their medals. So this really just kind of emphasizes the power of DNA to help us understand human migration from Africa into all the various corners of the planet. And you can see that they eventually ended up in Ireland there on the left-hand side. So why do we think group 3A is likely represents the descendants of the progenitor of the O'Malleys? Well, firstly, they're the biggest group in the entire project. Secondly, many of the members of that group actually have ancestry that comes from Mayo, 17 out of the 35 members. We can do dating of the various DNA markers, and this group is roughly about 1,000 years old. And the SNP signature is consistent with what we know from the ancient genealogies. You'll remember that I said that group 3A was linked to M222, which was associated with Nile of the 9 hostages. And if we look at the ancient genealogies, and here is a family tree, there is O'Malley down there in the middle, and this above O'Malley is the line of ascent, all the ancestors going back to Brian, who was the son of Uchi McMuaden. Uchi McMuaden had 5 sons, and one of those sons was on the far left, Niall of the 9 hostages, Niall Nagyalach. And there he is there. He's associated with M222, just like group 3A's. Group 3A is. So those are the ancient genealogies. They gave rise to many associated surnames, which we should see as genetic matches to the group 3A group, but it's too early to say whether there is definitely that pattern there. And the other big question is, where does Grace O'Malley fit into all of this story? Does she belong to group 3A as well? Now, of course, Grace, being a woman, won't have a Y DNA, won't have Y chromosome, but her father will have his father, his father, his father. So, looking at the genealogy for Grace O'Malley, there are various sources, and if you look down here at the bottom and the last 3 columns, these are the ones that mention the genealogy for Grace O'Malley herself. And the thing about these sources is that there is general agreement down to about the level of Malley or Malia that you see here in the first green line. And then there's general agreement between the various sources down to Murrah in this yellow line here at line 23. But there are 2 differing lines of descent thereafter. So we've got the blue line of descent, the green line of descent down to Grace. And both of these sources were actually validated by the Genealogical Office. One in 1832 by Sir William Beetham, another in 1946 by Edward MacLysaght. So which one is the correct one, we don't actually know at this point in time. But what we can say with a fair degree of confidence is that Grace descends from Malia or Malley, and therefore is likely to belong to group 3A. And that's the genetic signature we should be looking out for when we are testing people that go back to her immediate male forebears. And that really gave birth to the Finding Grace project. And here we see her represented in a carnival procession for St. Patrick's Day in 2017. And there she is waving her sword. But is she waving her sword, or is she cutting her birthday cake? Because in 8 years' time, in 2030, Grace O'Malley will be 500 years old. And part of the celebrations will be trying to detect how many of her living descendants can we detect on the Flaherty side of the family via her first husband, on the Burke side of the family via her second husband, because we need to invite them to the birthday party. The other group, of course, that we need to invite are the O'Malleys themselves, who would be cousins of Grace O'Malley, maybe 15 times removed. But that is where we're starting with this Finding Grace project, is trying to detect what is the genetic signature of Grace's immediate male forebears, and does anybody alive today still carry that signature? Now, the steps in the process are, first of all, to identify extensive lineages from various sources, like the validated pedigrees at the Genealogical Office, but also Burke's landed gentry, because some of the O'Malleys were baronets, they were landed gentry, and so on. And there's also private collections that we could use to detect these extensive lineages that connect back to Grace's immediate male forebears. So we've entered a lot of this data into the O'Malley clan family tree, and then began the process of tracing living descendants on the direct male line. And we started with Dermot, born about 1400, who was Grace's great-great-grandfather, and a lot of genealogical research and outreach was done by Brendan O'Malley, Emer Gunter, Tom O'Malley, and myself. And as a result of that, we have identified so far 13 living descendants of Grace's immediate male forebears. And what we did was we negotiated special prices with Family Tree DNA to have them tested, usually starting with the Y37 test and then progressing to the big Y test. And most of this funding was done either by the people themselves who agreed to do the testing, by the kit manager. We did raise some money for the general fund associated with the project, and many thanks to all people who contributed to that general fund. And we've also been applying for research grants. Brendan and myself, on behalf of the O'Malley Clan Association, put in a research grant to the Heritage Council, but sadly it was turned down because they only grant about 50% of the proposals that are submitted to them every year. But we're looking for other potential sources now as we go forward. The last step, and this still has to be done, is to attempt to validate each lineage using standards of 2022 and not of 1946 or 1832. So that is going to be a very, very interesting undertaking, and that will happen over the coming months. So let's look first of all at the results of steps 1 to 3, and these are the extensive lineages we've identified so far. And you can see that we've identified 5 lines. There's line 1 in the bottom left in green. Moving across, we have line 2, the Kilmilkin O'Malleys in blue. We have the Ballyburke O'Malleys on line 3. And then in line 4, we had the O'Malleys of Clunan, who apparently have died out because we could not find any living direct male line descendants today. And then line 5, which is the one in the middle in orange, there still may be descendants alive today, but the documentary evidence runs out after 3 generations. And that was from Donald na Pippa, who was Grace O'Malley's half-brother. So we tested all of these people, or a lot of them, as many as the money would allow, and the first results to come back were from 3 of the Kilmilkin O'Malleys. And you can see there, the ones in blue have done the big Y test, and their results showed that they had a DNA signature characterized by this SNP just here, FTC 36168. And that placed them in group 3G, which is completely different from group 3A. And this was an immediate, a spanner in the works. This is not an expected results. We were expecting them to be group 3A, like the majority of the male O'Malleys. So does this mean that, for example, the common ancestor with group 3A is more than 1,850 years ago, and that's well before the O'Malley surname was introduced. The O'Malley surname was introduced about 1,000 years ago. So what we can say is that these three men that have tested, that particular SNP marker was passed down to them by the ancestor on which they all triangulate. And that was Sean na Fianna, born in 1740. So Sean na Fianna had this SNP marker, and this SNP marker was passed down to three of his descendants, the ones that did the Big Y test. But what was the SNP signature of Sean na Fianna's father? Was it the same SNP, or was it something different? Had there been a switch in the DNA, a secret adoption, illegitimacy? There's 100 reasons for how that DNA could have been switched. The answer is we don't know. It could have been passed down all the way from Dermot at the very, very top there in 1490, this chap here. And it might even have come all the way down from Dermot, born in 1400, Grace's great-great-grandfather. So we didn't know at that point in time whether there had been a DNA switch or whether perhaps the genealogy was incorrect. Because, of course, a lot of people wanted to hook their genealogy onto the rich and famous genealogies for political prestige and for social reasons. So these are the questions that we still need to answer. Now, the second set of results were these ones down here on the bottom left, and these were two first cousins. And they came back, their Y37 results came back as a match to each other. So they were certainly, it proved that they were cousins, number one. But the other thing is that they had a very strong match to other people in group 3A. So this was what we were looking for. And of course, we have to be careful that we don't fall into the trap of expectation bias. But this was a very encouraging result. And then the next one to come back was also another group 1 member. You see it there in the red square. And his results showed that he belonged to a completely different genetics. He had a completely different genetic signature. He belonged to a completely different group. There probably was a DNA switch somewhere along the lines, but we'd no idea where. The common ancestor with group 3A was more than 40,000 years ago. So something has happened on that particular line. And we don't know how far back that particular signature goes. Does it go back to his father, his grandfather? We don't know at this point in time, but maybe when we get the results of his second cousin, this chap down here beside him on the left, that might tell us exactly if the red DNA signature goes back to the common ancestor, which is this one here, Owen 1857, triangulation point number 12. So we still have to wait for those results. Now the next results to come back were the Big Y results for one of the first cousins, and he had a particular SNP signature called FTA 85293. And this placed him right in the middle of group 3A, and I'll show you that in a second. And then the next one to come back was from line 3 over on the right-hand side, and that person's Y111 results came back first. A very strong match to group 3A, just like line 1. And this is very encouraging. And then the next results to come back were his Big Y results, which showed that he had exactly the same SNP marker as we had seen in line 1. So line 1 and line 3 individuals had exactly the same SNP marker. And what this meant was that line 1 goes all the way back there, line 3 goes all the way back there to a common ancestor that passed this specific SNP marker down to both of them. The question is, was that common ancestor Grace's great-great-grandfather? And we are still on the road to trying to establish that. We will need to validate these lineages to answer that question, or attempt to answer that question, and we need to test other people in line 1 and line 3 to gather additional information to help us address this. But so far, what we can say is that members from line 1 and members from line 3 do triangulate on a common ancestor, and we just need to establish whether it was Dermot, born in 1400, the great-great-grandfather of Grace O'Malley. And that will take a lot of genealogical work validating each generation in each of these lines all the way up to that point. So this is very encouraging results so far, because when you think about it, we could have had spanners thrown in the works at every step of the way, and if line 3 did not match line 1, then that was the project down, out, dusted. But what does it mean for the other members of Group 3A? Because a lot of people have done the Big Y test, but they have lines where their O'Malley ancestors go back as far as maybe 1800, and then they can't get back any further. Well, line 1 sits here, and line 3 sits here. So what this means is that if this SNP marker up here is the DNA signature of Grace's great-great-grandfather, then the nearest cousins to that particular individual will be these ones here, 949-804, 951-980, and these are first cousins to each other. They are from Michigan, and we have a representative of the family sitting with us in the audience today. So you have to be very nice to him, because he could be a relative of Grace O'Malley. So this is the exciting part of the project, is that if we can establish this for sure, it means that anybody who can prove a connection to any of the extensive lineages that we are studying, either through Y-DNA, or through autosomal DNA, or simply through genealogical records, then they too can claim to be related to Grace O'Malley via her great-great-grandfather. So they would be maybe third cousins 12 times removed. But you can still say, well, Grace O'Malley, she's my third cousin. And that would be a very nice thing to be able to say. So we can also estimate the date at which these various branches occurred. And if we do that, we have a variety of different dates for these different branching points. You have to be very careful with these, though, because these are really just best guesses. And there's a huge range, as you can see, on either side. So the 95% confidence intervals here are really quite wide, 200, 300 years on either side of the central estimate. And we have to be aware of confirmation bias and expectation bias. But these are currently the crude dates that would be associated with each of the branching points in Group 3A. And the tantalizing thing here is that if you look at the date 1387, just up here, that is actually very, very close to Dermot, Grace's great-great-grandfather, born around about 1400. So it raises the interesting question, is that marker, or maybe this one below it, are they the DNA signature of Grace's immediate male forebears? So hopefully with additional testing and some additional research, we will be able to answer that question. So many Big Y test takers who aren't associated with these extensive lineages have a brick wall at 1800. Their Big Y results are very useful for helping us to date the specific branching points in the Tree of Mankind, in the O'Malley portion of the Tree of Mankind. And like I say, hopefully anyone who connects to line 1 or line 3 can potentially claim descent from Dermot, Grace's great-great-grandfather, born about 1400. And that's whether it's via genealogical records, Y-DNA, or autosomal DNA, that connection to these extensive lineages is made. So the next steps are to continue to look for funding from various sources, to continue to look for other descendants of Dermot, born in 1400, and triangulated back as far as possible. We need to continue the validation process of each of these ancestral lineages. we will actually get more accurate TMRCA dates, because there is an expert that I know quite well who is willing to get involved with that project when we have all the data together. Next presentations, well, on July the 9th, a similar presentation to this will be made to a US audience, an international audience, at the Celtic Connections Conference, and also on August the 13th we have a presentation planned in Westport House, where we will have even more data than what has been presented today. And the aim is ultimately to produce a scientific publication with all the data we're collecting, and a book, because I think that would be a very nice keepsake for a lot of people, especially for all the people who've been involved in the DNA project. And my last slide is just a slide to say thank you and to pay tribute to all of the O'Malley scholars who have gone before us, many of whom are actually still with us, but it is on their shoulders that we stand, and they have paved the way and created a wonderful foundation for O'Malley genealogical research. So I'd just like to pay tribute to them and to say thank you to them, to say thank you to everybody who's been involved in the DNA project, and to say thank you for your kind attention. Now, I'm not sure if we have time for a few questions, Ellen. It doesn't matter, but just in case, I don't know what the timelines are. What do you think? It's tight. So I will be around for the next few days. Please do come up and ask any questions that you like. And what I will do now is I'll hand back to Ellen. Thanks very much.